Hello everyone, welcome to my tutorial. I'm going to talk about database transaction. We need to understand what a transaction is, and in terms of database transactions, we do a few things. We do a retrieve data, we update data, we create data, and then we delete data. Okay, so here is my application, and the application is connected to a DB. So let's take an example of a data which is a user, and user has a name as XYZ. In order to do the operation, what we do, we are going to first retrieve data, and then retrieve data is coming from database, and then we change data XYZ over here to, let's say, ABC. Now at this point the database is still having the name XYZ. So whenever we are saving it, after that it becomes ABC. So now we can understand that the whole thing, from retrieving to updating and to saving, this whole thing is a transaction. If something happens that we are not able to connect to the database, or the database connection is lost, then what happens? This change will not be reflected over here. So in my application it will be ABC, but in the database it will be still XYZ. Okay, so in order to make a transaction, we need to do thing, or we need to make sure that it happens as a whole, or all the operations happen as a whole. And if something breaks down, we need to do something called rollback. So I'll be talking about the rollback later on. Now let's talk about the definition itself. So a transaction is a unit of work that you want to treat as a whole. It has to either happen in full or not at all. Okay, so the operation is basically retrieving the data you change in your application and then saving. So all these things have to be done as a whole. That is what we are calling that unit of work. A classical example is transferring money from one bank account to another. To do that, you have first to withdraw the amount from the source account and then deposit it to the destination account. The operation has to succeed in full, and if you stop halfway, the money will be lost, and that is very bad. So that's why we need to make sure that all the operations are happening at the same time. Now let's look into the different transaction type, and in terms of Java JPA, we have two type of transaction types. One is the JTA and the other one is the resource local. So in JTA, it is managed by application server JTA implementation, and container will create and track the supply of entity manager. Okay, so that means the container itself is responsible for handling and tracking of the entity manager. But this is not the case in case of resource local. So resource local is another transaction type, which is a basic JDBC level transaction, and developer is responsible for entity manager creating and tracking. Use entity transaction API to begin commit around every call to entity manager. Transaction is local to the JPA persistence unit, so a transaction that involves multiple persistence units or other DBs is not very suitable for resource local. Okay, so that means in one word, if it is JTA, it's the job of the container, but if it is a resource local, it's the job of the developer to track the entity manager transactions. Now let's look into the transaction itself. A transaction is a set of operations that will fail or succeed as a single unit We talked about that before. It can be committed or rolled back as a unit. So that means if it is successful, it will be committed. If it is failure, it is rolled back to the previous state. And each call of an entity manager action, that means let's say like find or persist or remove, needs to be wrapped by an active transaction. So we can see here that we have created an entity transaction, and then the transaction begins, and within that we are doing the operations, entity manager operations like find or persist or whatever it needs to be, and then we are committing the transaction. So the thing that need to be remembered over here is that if it is a resource local, or whenever the developer himself is responsible for doing the transaction, it needs to be wrapped within transaction begin and transaction commit. Okay. Now, in order to roll back, and rollback always happens when there is a problem in the transaction. That means the transaction didn't happen, or something bad happened, the connection lost, or we couldn't save to the database. And that is what we are calling a failed transaction. So a failed transaction needs to be brought to its earlier state. And how do we do that? We have to put that in a catch and finally block. And remember, in the catch block, if transaction is not null, that means we are over here and the transaction failed. So we are coming to the catch block, and still the transaction is there. So we have to make sure that we call this method transaction.rollback. And then finally, we have to close the entity manager. Okay, that is important. All right, so that's all for today. Thank you.